In 1985, the British rock band Tears for Fears had a #1 hit single entitled "Everybody Wants to Rule the World." They stole the line from an anti-war song by The Clash called "Charlie Don't Surf," whose lyrics are, "Everybody wants to rule the world, must be something we get from birth. One truth is we never learn, satellites will make space burn." It's a difficult truth for us to learn, but everybody does want to rule the world. The problem is, nobody wants to serve. My friend Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove recently said, "Everybody wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes." Everybody wants to be great, but nobody wants to be the least. Everybody wants to be first, but no one wants to be last. Everybody wants glory, nobody wants to give. Everybody wants to sit in the seat of honor, but nobody wants to wait on tables. Everybody wants to be seated at the right hand of God, but nobody wants to walk the hard road of suffering. The desire for power and prestige, position, honor, esteem, and greatness are inescapable and instinctual parts of our human nature. Witness, for instance, James and John and their quest for glory. The Zebedee brothers, along with Peter, were part of Jesus' inner circle. He called Peter the Rock and nicknamed the Zebedee boys Sons of Thunder. Certifiable proof, in my opinion, that Jesus had a wild sense of humor. There was nothing solid or rock-like about Peter. And the only noise the Zebedee brothers ever made were loud and hasty requests to bring down fire on a village of Samaritans and begging Jesus to grant them positions of honor and authority in the kingdom. Thunderous, sure, but not the kind of sound that cracks the sky and shakes the ground and leaves everyone awestruck. No, the Zebedee boys were more like a couple of noisy gongs and clanging cymbals. They came to Jesus with an arrogant request. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do whatever we ask." And the process of manipulation had already begun. If a person asks you to do something without telling you what it is, you should run in the opposite direction. But Jesus was no fool, and he refused to play into the Thunder Brothers' vain ambitions for glory. First, he patiently tried to reason with them by saying, "You don't even know what you're asking. There's no seat of honor without sacrifice. There's no glory without guts. Do you really want to walk the road of suffering that I am walking? Do you really want to drink the cup of sacrifice I am drinking, or be baptized into the deadly waters that I am immersed in?" At that point, you'd think that cooler heads would prevail and the Thunder Brothers might say, "You know what? We're good with whatever seats we get in the kingdom." But the Zebedee boys were unfazed by Jesus' warning, and with sarcasm dripping off the pages of the Gospel of Mark, they respond to the prospect of suffering and death by saying, "No problem, we're able." The irony, of course, is that in the end, when Jesus would come into glory, the Thunder Brothers would be nowhere to be found. There would be one on Jesus' right and one on Jesus' left when he was lifted on the cross, but it would not be James and John. Instead, it would be two rebels and thieves. When the going got rough and the push came to shove, the Zebedee brothers would abandon Jesus, run away, and hide. Not very great, if you ask me. It's easy for us to look back at James and John and marvel at how misguided they were and to get angry at them, like the other 10 disciples did in the story, but we all struggle with this desire for greatness. We all want power and authority and control. We all long for prestige and respect, positions of honor and esteem. In a sermon on this text in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King said how very quickly we automatically condemn James and John and say that they were selfish. But before we condemn them too quickly, let us look calmly and honestly at ourselves and discover that we too have the same basic desires for recognition, for importance, the same desire for attention, the same desire to be the first. There is deep down within us what King called a kind of drum major instinct, a desire to be out in front, a desire to lead the parade, a desire to be the first. So before we condemn them, let us see that we all want to be important, to surpass others, to achieve distinction, to lead the parade. The drum major instinct is just another word for pride, the desire that leads us into prestigious fraternal organizations, to rub elbows with the rich and famous, to live above our means, to keep up with the Joneses, to follow the advertising that appeals to our basest desires, to let our egos run rampant over the lives of others, to be snobbish and exclusive, to act with prejudice, pious self-righteousness, or a sense of our own superiority. Even the war in Vietnam was, for King, in his opinion, the result of our American pride played out on a global scale. He said, "You may have thought that Jesus would say to James and John, 'You are out of your place. Why would you raise such a question?' But he did something different entirely. Jesus reordered their priorities. He said, 'I see you want to be first. I see you want to be great. I see you want to be important. I see that you want to be significant. Don't give up on this instinct. It's good if you use it right. Keep feeling the need to be important. Keep feeling the need to be first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity.'" As a response to the Zebedee boys' quest for power, Jesus offered them an invitation to participate in a movement based on a redefinition of power that flew in the face of everything the Roman Empire stood for, counter to what all the nations of the world stand for. He presented the Thunder Brothers and all of his disciples with an invitation to join up for a totally different kind of empire called the Kingdom of God. This new empire would begin with a role reversal that upset the status hierarchy of the ancient world. It was a personal spirituality, a leadership philosophy, a social theory, and a political theology, all rolled up into one. Jesus proclaimed to the disciples, "You know how it is among the Gentiles, the Romans, the nations of the world. Their rulers lord over them. Their great ones are tyrants over them. But it should not be so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant." As Americans, we ought to take note of the way Jesus associated greatness with tyranny. To be clear, Jesus was not denouncing power as evil in and of itself. He was offering the disciples an alternative vision of what to do with their power. Instead of lording it over people or tyrannizing others, they were to be different by using their power to serve the world. The Greek word for service was not as bland and as colorless as we often make it today. It signified waiting on tables, a menial task, which at the time was the burden of slaves and women only. The table was the place in society where their caste systems of the first century were the most obvious. The rich and the powerful reclined comfortably at the table as slaves and women served them. There were no napkins in those days, and scholars have shown us that it was common for guests to wipe off their greasy fingers on the hair of the servants who were waiting on them. I know it's hard for you to imagine. I don't have any hair, but imagine if they were. It was very degrading. One Greek philosopher said, "How could anyone be happy serving anyone at all?" But Jesus took that first century form of degradation and exploitation and used it as the foundation for a new vision for society built around a common table where he was the servant. And it's no surprise then that the first leadership positions in the early church, the deacons, were born from waiting on tables for neglected widows. Jesus had challenged the conventional definition of power and leadership. The starting point for his revolution would begin with a community where the leaders were not rulers or tyrants, but servants first. We live, of course, today in a culture that consistently preaches to us the opposite message. From birth to death, we are told that we should strive always to be first in line, to be the greatest, to be the best, which means that we are often unaware of the ways that our ego can take our lives completely off track. I was 18 when I was first called into the ministry, and I went off to military school in southern Alabama to become an Army chaplain. And on the first day, all the cadets lined us up on the quad and asked us which branch of military service we wanted to go into. Some said infantry, others said armor, Others said artillery. And then when they got to me, I said chaplaincy. And all the cadets just laughed at me. It was totally embarrassing. And I wanted to be the best of the best. And so even though I went into military school, called into ministry, I somehow left as an infantry officer. My pride got the better of me. The same thing happened again in seminary at Duke. You know, it takes a while for people to learn these lessons. I went there to be a pastor, but I quickly discovered early on in seminary that pastors were considered the lowest form of humanity. Why would anyone want to be a pastor? That was for the kids who couldn't hack it in church history class. The best of the best were going on to be professors. So even though I went to seminary to become a pastor, I left on the way to a PhD program in Washington, D.C. Again, my ego got the better of me. And as I was there working on a doctorate, I was also pastoring a little church in Alexandria, Virginia, and one of the days that I was there serving in ministry, the pipes burst in the basement and gallons of raw sewage poured out all over the floors of the church nursery. And so I immediately called a cleaning company who came over and gave an estimate and said they could clean it up for $2,000. And then I called the chair of deacons and he said, "Don't do anything, I'll be there in a minute." The chair was a man named Tracy, who was a hotshot lawyer for Sprint, who was always at the church looking for some way to serve. And I'll never forget when he came into my office and said, "We're not going to hire that company. It's way too expensive." And I protested, "Okay, Tracy, who's going to do it then?" He looked at me and said, "You and I are going to do it." And I said, I must have heard you wrong. Did you say that you and I were going to do it? And in my mind, I was thinking, Tracy, you may have forgotten that I'm the senior pastor here at this church. And I'm also, maybe you forgot, a graduate of the Duke University. And I have a license to preach, and I'm ordained to the gospel ministry. There must be someone else, Tracy, who could clean up this mess. But Tracy interrupted my arrogant inner monologue, handed me a mop, and said, "All right, let's go." As I waded up to my ankles in raw sewage for the next few hours, cleaning the nursery with Tracy, I reflected on my pride. All the evasions of my vocation in military school and seminary came rushing back. And I remembered why I was called to the ministry in the first place. It was the same reason that I had gone into the army. It was not for glory or for greatness. It was to serve. There's nothing really glorious about service. It's a nonstop, pride-swallowing siege. As soon as you think you've done something great, someone will inevitably tell you what they think of you, and it knocks you right back down to size. Our pride is often what gets in the way of us following Jesus and giving our lives in service to others. I went off to D.C., striving to be the best of the best, looking for a place of honor, and Jesus handed me a mop and a bucket. He said, "Ben, do you love me?" And I replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said, "Clean my nursery." Whenever we invite ourselves into the places of power and honor, Jesus invites us into the lowest places where we can do nothing but serve. As we kick off this season of stewardship, Jesus is inviting all of us into service, to consider how we might be good stewards of our financial resources, and also how we might be good stewards of our time and talents, our heart, our mind, our body, our souls, our energy, and our power by using it to serve others, to serve humanity, to serve the poor and the vulnerable and the oppressed. Many of you are already serving the community and this church with every moment of free time that you have, and we praise God for you. But each of us are called to do our part, and we want to invite you to get engaged in one of the many opportunities that we have to serve here that Karen mentioned this morning. There are so many different ways we can serve one another in the church and in the world. But Jesus was not just offering us a path for personal growth and development. He was turning the world upside down rejecting all the social patterns of servanthood and subjugation and domination that regulated Mediterranean society, and calling people to become the lowest form of humanity, the very thing they despised, a servant. It was quite radical to call people into service, to ask them to surrender the ability to manipulate the mechanisms of power, to renounce exploitation, to put oneself at the disposal of others, to seek the benefit of another person before themselves. But Jesus embodied this vocation of leadership in his own life. In our pride, we often imagine ourselves to be better than Jesus. But he modeled this for us when he took a towel and tied it around his waist and got down on his hands and knees and assumed the lowest form of labor in the world and transformed it into a way of life and liberation. He made service the path to salvation. To understand how radical this was, we only have to imagine if only American Christian slaveholders had read this text rightly and taken it seriously. How could anyone own a slave when Jesus had already called his followers to be servants? Or imagine what would it be like today if we decided to choose our leaders in the church and in society and in the world based on who is serving people the most and not who we think is the greatest. Our world would be a very, very different place. Dr. King concluded his sermon by saying, Jesus gave us a new definition of greatness. And that definition of greatness means that everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve, he said. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato or Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need, he said, a heart of grace and a soul generated by love, and you can be a servant. And then King went on to say this, which I think is even more important. And if you are around when I have to meet my day, tell them not to mention that I got a Nobel Peace Prize. Tell them not to mention the 300 or 400 other awards I had. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that I died and tried to love somebody. I would like for someone to say on that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want somebody to say on that day that I tried to clothe the naked and feed the hungry and visit those who were in prison. I want you to say I tried to love and serve humanity. What about us? What do we want people to say about us when it's all said and done? Do we want them to say everybody wants to rule the world, but nobody wants to serve? Or do we want them to say, well done, good and faithful servant. Well done. Whenever we strive for greatness, to be the first and the best, to rule the world, the ruler of the world will invite us to another path, the path of service. And the invitation from Jesus is always the same. It is an invitation to put away our pride and to check our egos, to surrender our arrogance and hubris and conceit, to acknowledge our wild ambitions and to walk away from the desire for honor and respect and prestige and position, to walk down the stairs instead of up, to roll up our sleeves, to grab the mop and the bucket, to pick up a towel and to put on an apron around our waist, to get down on our hands and knees and become truly great by being first in something that really matters, first in service, first in generosity, first in moral excellence, first in humility, first in peace, first in justice, first in compassion, the first in love. And all we have to do when the invitation comes is say yes. Amen.